Right by Them, a Magnus Archives fanfiction written by Esperosis and read by Ibis Podfic. Chapter 15. First Date. The entire time John speaks, retelling one of the worst moments of his life to his most trusted friends, he can't help but feel that lingering sense of wrongness once again. It bothers him more than he can describe, the sense he's missing something. Something important enough to press into his mind that's gone, but somehow subtle enough to pass under his perception. It's maddening, yet he still finds the words flowing out of him like water, pulled out and thrust into the light by the all-seeing eye that ruins and rules their lives. I could never stop wondering, John said, if maybe I had just done something different, ripped the book out of his hands, or just, I don't know, he sighed. In all likelihood, there really wasn't anything I could have done, but the thoughts still haunt me. That fear still haunts me. The utter lack of control of my own actions, the feeling of being puppeted around like a doll, it terrifies me even now. I hate the feeling of not being in control. Not in the sense where I want to control everyone around me, mind you, just the feeling of someone else controlling me. Inspires, I suppose. Every time I see them, the image of those legs pulling that older boy inside, his cut-off scream, and the impassive eyes of that awful thing on the cover. Yes, I don't like them very much at all. John laughed breathily. That's it, I suppose. Statement ends, and all that. Everyone let out a breath they likely didn't know they had been holding, enraptured by the archivist's statement. John bit back the urge to scowl, unable to feel anything but resentment at his growing power and the echoes of fear the statement incurred. I had no idea, Georgie looked at him sadly. I never exactly told you, John gave her a sad smile. You know it wasn't your fault, right? Tim spoke up. You were 8 years old, for fuck's sake. John opened his mouth to reply, then closed it, then opened it again. I mean, I suppose I know, but it's hard to, No, Tim shut down. No, maybe I could have, or if I had just, it's just, you were 8, Tim looked incensed. That shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have, John agreed. But it did. John felt warm arms surrounding him, and when he turned to look, Martin had wrapped himself around John in an embrace, shaking slightly. Martin? I'm sorry, Martin buried his face in John's hair. That's really awful, John. John opened his mouth to reply, but what was he supposed to say? Oh, it's all right. I've had worse. Did I tell you about the time I was nearly executed by a cop in the forest, or got kidnapped and moisturized by evil skin-stealing clowns for a month while nobody even knew I was missing? And it was terrible. It was the first mark he had ever gotten, and it had haunted him his entire life. It set him on the path to becoming the monstrosity he would soon become all over again. So he didn't say anything. He allowed himself to accept the comfort offered, sinking into his lover's arms. Eventually, much too soon, Martin released his hold on John, and it took every ounce of willpower left in John's body not to follow him as he retreated. What happened to the boy? Tim finally asked. Did you tell the police? Was there an investigation? Did they ever find out what happened to him? John didn't need the eye to tell him what this was about. You already knew. I tried to talk to the police, but they thought I was making up some tall tale. As for what happened to the boy, I'm pretty sure they just chalked it up to him running away or something. As you can imagine, he wasn't the most well-behaved young man. Did they even look? Tim's voice seemed to shrivel even further. Sasha placed a hand on his arm. No, John admitted. I tried to convince them to, but no. Martin's face was crumpled in concern. All those times I tried to help you with your arachnophobia. It's quite all right, Martin, John smiled at him. Again, I never told you. I hardly imagine you thought my aversion was due to a giant mind-controlling spider in a children's book. Martin gave a laugh, but it fell a bit flat as he refused to meet John's eyes. I guess I just keep screwing up and hurting you, huh? John's face fell. What? Thank you for telling us, John, Sasha spoke up, glancing at Martin, who avoided her gaze and shifted awkwardly. I guess there's a lot of weird supernatural stuff in the world we don't know about yet. Doesn't matter, Tim glared at nothing in particular. This has gone way too far. I agree, Sasha nodded. John looked to Martin, then Georgie, who just gave a pained smile, then back to Tim and Sasha, both of them looking at him, terrified. Right, John nodded to the four of them. We need to stick together, all of us. We have no idea the kinds of things we're up against. I might be able to provide some more insight, Georgie spoke up. What? John asked, alarmed. I've had an encounter too. You have? The three assistants turned to her, and cold dread chilled John to the bone. Georgie nodded. Yeah, sit down. I'll tell you about it. Georgie, John swallowed hard. You don't have to. No, John, it's all right. You're right. We should talk about this. We need to know all the sorts of things we could be up against, Georgie explained. So Georgie is officially in Team Archives versus the Underworld, Tim joked. Georgie frowned. I don't really want to be involved too much. I get it. You're all kind of stuck with it. But I prefer to keep my distance from the thick of it, if that makes sense. I'll help you how I can, but I get it, Georgie. John gave her an encouraging smile. I mean, I don't think any of you want to end up like. He gestured with his right arm to himself and the bed. Everyone winced. I'll help how I can, Georgie concluded. That makes total sense, Sasha agreed. We'll try to keep you out of anything dangerous or weird. I appreciate that, she sighed. Now, as for my encounter with the supernatural, John couldn't stop himself from cutting her off. Are you really sure, Georgie? It's not pleasant to relive these sorts of things. It's okay, John, she laughed. It was a long time ago, and the emotions have faded. If you're sure, I'd be interested to hear about it, Sasha spoke, and John felt his heart fall. Georgie turned to her and began to speak. He prayed that since she was addressing the group and not John directly, that it wouldn't count as a statement. But as the words flowed out of her mouth, aided by the eye and so terribly reminiscent of the first time he'd heard her tell him the story, he never was that lucky. Georgie concluded the story by telling them how she had never felt fear again after that moment, and John felt the exhaustion hit him like a truck. His own live statement, and then Georgie's. It was too much. He sunk into the pillows behind him, and was barely able to keep his eyes open as Tim and Sasha commented something John couldn't place. He felt warm fingers caress his face, and he tilted his face into it, his eyes cracking open just a sliver to find Martin smiling warmly at him. Get some rest, John, Martin whispered to him, and John hummed as he faded into unconsciousness. John's left hand was effectively crippled, the details of which were still extremely foggy even a week after he had first awoke. It had purged the corruption from his body, but the damage was still done. The bones in his left hand were so brittle that even lifting something particularly heavy could cause them to snap and shatter. To fix this, John needed multiple surgeries on his hand, replacing almost all of the affected bone with transplants and metal. All the bones in his hand and up to his elbow needed to be replaced, and by the time the doctors were done, his left hand and lower arm was a mess of long white scars running parallel and intersecting each other. Fortunately, the Institute, and by extension Elias, was covering all medical expenses. It was the least he could do since he put him there in the first place. It was difficult and painful to try and do anything with the arm, his muscles spasming almost constantly. His grip and coordination were awful. The doctors told him he'd likely need years of physical therapy to regain even a fraction of his normal motor function. In conclusion, his hand was fucked. John lay in his hospital bed, flexing and curling his fingers over and over again, as per the doctor's orders to exercise them. He idly wondered if, when he became the archivist, if it would heal his hand fully. Unlikely. He had never been that lucky before, and marks were meant to leave their, well, marks. He gritted his teeth and stopped, the pain having built to the point he was nearly gasping. He let his fingers relax, and he leaned back against the pillows. The pain throbbed and pulsated in his fingers and wrist, so he concentrated on breathing in and out to his mouth and nose, screwing his eyes shut and just letting the pain wash over and out of him. He had been seeing Georgie in his dreams. The first morning he had awoken after seeing her, he had sobbed into his pillow for nearly an hour. Tim hadn't asked about it when he had arrived with the blueberry muffin he had snuck in. He just sat next to John, an arm around his shoulders as John wiped away his tears. He hadn't brought it up with Georgie yet. She came to visit every day, but neither of them had mentioned it. He didn't know how to bring it up, and it seemed that she didn't either. If she thought the dreams were real, that was. Still, he appreciated her visits. She had even recorded an episode of What the Ghost in his hospital room, having him as a guest star. It was nice, talking about completely mundane horrors for a change. Aside from Georgie, his assistants have been stopping by regularly. Elias had been oh so kind as to grant him medical leave, not even take any days out of his sick time due to the nature of his medical issues, and that they were an on-site injury. His assistants, however, have been a completely different story. They had all requested time off to spend with John while he was in the hospital. But since John was out sick, Elias needed all hands on deck, and denied all the requests so as not to let things get too backed up. Prick. So now his friends were routinely finding themselves out on follow-up that would take quite a few hours before they would manage to get back to the Institute to find that, oh no, it seemed the investigations were inconclusive. He was visited by at least one of them every day. Tim and Sasha most often, Martin less so. He knew why. Tim and Sasha were likely finding few excuses to send him out, probably saying something along the lines of them being researchers. He hated how they mistrusted Martin around him. Still, he could only hope they'd switch their attention soon. He had managed to plant a few seeds of mistrust towards Elias, and mentioned how he had a strange dream about what Elias had done. He had been able to give many details, as he genuinely didn't remember any, but it seemed to work slightly. Sasha had even mentioned it was strange Elias was in the archives during the incident, as they were now calling it. It was dangerous, making them suspicious of Elias, especially if a particularly nosy Sasha looked too far into things. But in the height of his paranoia, the most he had ever found out about Elias was that he, when he used to actually be Elias, was a pothead. He didn't suspect Sasha would do much better. Elias was slippery, and more than that, nearly omniscient. He'd see and thwart Sasha's snooping safely before she got too close to the truth. Good Lord, was he entrusting Elias to protect his assistants from himself? John didn't like that at all. Yet it made a sick sort of sense. Elias didn't want to be discovered too early, so he'd make sure that didn't happen. But he already knew they were suspicious of him after the move he made against John, so he'd lay low on any drastic action from now. God, John hated this, and he hated Elias. The door to his room opened, and John looked to see who it was. Hey, John, Martin smiled, and John smiled back at him. Hello, Martin, John said fondly. Martin's hesitant smile brightened. How have you been doing? Oh, you know. John lifted his trembling hand a little before letting it drop again. Same old, same old. How have you been doing? I'm all right, Martin walked across the room. The doctor said you'll be released soon? Yes, John confirmed as Martin sat down. They want to keep me for a few more days to make sure the organs heal properly. Then I can head home on bed rest and light activity. So I'll be back in the archives soon. Martin narrowed his eyes. Back in the archives after your bed rest, right, John? Yes, he coughed. Of course. John, Martin sighed, your organs were literally rotting because of some weird supernatural infection. You need to rest. Yes, I know, John frowned. I've been cooped up in this bed for nearly 2 weeks now, and that's just the time I've been conscious. I want to get up and move again. Well, Martin brightened, I might have a solution for that, actually. John raised an eyebrow. Oh? Yeah. So, I actually checked with the nurses and doctors and everything. They said as long as you don't strain yourself, you could get out of bed. So, I was thinking, maybe we could try going on that date that got postponed. John opened his mouth to reply, but Martin cut him off as his demeanor immediately shuddered. That is, if you still want to. I understand if you don't. What? Martin! John laughed incredulously. Of course I still want to go on a date with you. Why wouldn't I? Martin winced as he worried the hem of his jumper. Right. Well, I got a wheelchair. The hospital said I could use it to push you around so you didn't have to walk so much. And there's an exit out to the park next door. I thought we could, I don't know, walk around? Martin finally looked at him again. Or, he laughed nervously, I guess I would be the one walking, since you're, in a wheelchair. That sounds wonderful, Martin, John smiled at him, barely able to contain the love he felt for the man. Martin seemed to pick up on some of it, though, as he went pink rather quickly. Great! I'll just, grab the wheelchair and help you up. Martin stood and quickly made his way back to the door. That's all right, John reassured him with a grunt as he began to push himself upright. I can... John! Martin turned and rushed to his side. You need to be careful. I'm quite all right, John said as he struggled to swing his legs over the side, trying to get up. I can stand up. Please don't hurt yourself. Martin grabbed his arm as he stopped John from getting up. Martin froze, seeming to realize just how close they were. Martin holding John close as he crowded him. He sparred for a moment before going entirely red. John resisted the urge to kiss him. All right, he saved Martin from himself. I'll wait here. I'll... Martin snapped his mouth shut and nodded, quickly exiting and re-entering the room with the wheelchair, his face cherry red and his eyes looking anywhere but John. John started to get up again, and Martin made a noise of protest. I need to get into the chair, Martin, he laughed as he stood on shaking legs. Oh, right, yeah, Martin nodded. Are you? I'm all right, John grunted as he carefully lowered himself into the wheelchair. He knew he still needed the rest, that his body had gone through something traumatic while he was still so fragilely human. Still, the fact he was struggling just to get out of his bed and into a wheelchair was pathetic and frustrating, but he swallowed the embarrassment and the anger, bringing it deep down as he turned and smiled up at Martin, who was just now beginning to return to his normal colors. He wanted to enjoy his time with the man. This was the first date they had been able to go on, in this or his original timeline, and he intended to enjoy every second of it. Lead the way. John settled himself into the chair, placing his feet on the footrests. Right, Martin nodded, pulling a blanket off the bed and settling it over John's legs. Then he gripped the wheelchair as he slowly began to move it backward, backing it out of the space between the wall and the bed, and then steering it out of the room entirely. John idly noted that this was the same hospital he'd been in for his coma. It was likely the closest hospital to the institute, meaning it probably also had quite a few doctors that dealt with strange patients. It was nice, nothing special. It didn't seem to have been renovated between now and the time he had originally been there. God, time travel was confusing. He hadn't even known it had an exit leading to the nearby park. He didn't even think he had known there was a park next door. Well, he had likely known, but it wasn't really important to consider. No, focus on Martin. He was enjoying his time with Martin now. The doors opened automatically in front of them, and Martin took them down the gentle wheelchair-accessible ramp, down to the path into the park. It was a lonely day, with puffy white clouds and a light blue sky lit by the sun. The wind was gentle, shaking the leaves, which painted dancing patterns of sunlight onto the pair as they traveled down the cement path. There weren't many flowers or anything like that, mostly just grass and trees, but it was nice, the canopy sprawling out above them and the sound of birdsong filling the air. It was a breath of fresh air from the pavement jungle covered in mechanical eyes that was London. Here, the only eyes there were the ones in the trees of the trunks. and John was confident Elias couldn't spy on them through those. He relaxed as he leaned back and tilted his head to stare up at Martin. He looked so soft like this, a soft and beautiful man surrounded by soft and beautiful clouds, almost seeming to orbit his head like a halo, crested by the sun itself. "You're beautiful," John smiled, because he could say that. He finally could. Martin went in such a lovely shade of pink as he looked down at John's love-drunk smile. It was lovely. The warm pink contrasted so well with the blue of the sky. John smiled wider as he tried not to blink, not wanting to miss the image of Martin for a moment. Martin sputtered, "I mean what?" "I'm hardly the—" Martin fiddled with the hands of the wheelchair. "You're much more attractive than I am." "Hardly," John laughed. "I mean it," Martin insisted, looking down at him. "I mean, look at me." "I am." John reached up and touched his hand to Martin's, practically feeling the way Martin's breath caught in his throat. "I'm quite enjoying it." "I don't—" Martin blushed more. You're beautiful," John repeated himself, willing Martin to believe it. Martin looked him in the eye, maintaining his gaze for a moment before seeming to force himself away. "I don't understand." "Understand what?" John asked as he rubbed his thumb against Martin's hand, but much to John's surprise, Martin pulled away. Suddenly, cold fear shot through John. Did he overdo it? Did he scare Martin off? Had he gotten too excited and acted like a creep or something? Oh, God! Martin was going to leave him. Oh, no! Oh, no! Oh! How could you? Martin stopped and took a shuddering breath as he, much to John's horror, began to tear up. "I'm sorry," John immediately apologized, twisting in his wheelchair to face Martin better, ignoring the dull pain in his abdomen. "I was too forward. No," Martin shook his head as he half laughed, half sobbed. "Just don't understand. How can you stomach to even be near me, yet alone still want to be with me?" John's brain stalled for a moment as he gaped at Martin. "I mean, John, I nearly killed you." Martin ran his hand through his hair. "You were—" His throat closed up, and the sobs finally ripped their way through Martin's chest as he took a step back from the wheelchair and balled up his fist. "That wasn't your fault, Martin," John pleaded. "It was," Martin cried. "I was the one who put together all those papers. I was the one that somehow missed those papers. He bit his lip and shook his head. "Everyone knows it was me. My fuck-up that nearly killed you. Elias chewed me out for it, and I know Sasha and Tim blame me too. They try to hide it, but I can—" "It wasn't your fault," John insisted. "You don't—" "Martin, look at me," John told him, awkwardly reaching out and stretching in his seat until he could grab Martin's hand. "John—" "Look at me, Martin," John continued. "Look into my eyes, okay?" Martin stared at John's hand, his good one, desperately clutched at his own. He slowly nodded and looked up at John with watery eyes and shaking shoulders. John looked Martin in the eyes and poured every ounce of sincerity into his words that he could. "This wasn't your fault. This wasn't even remotely your fault, Martin. You're not to blame for anything that happened. But You did nothing wrong, Martin," John told him. "You didn't put those pages in that pile," Martin sobbed. "But how do you know that?" John smiled up at him, pouring every ounce of love he felt in his entire body into his words. "Because you wouldn't have—" Martin's sobbing hitched as he began to tremble even more. "You don't believe that." "I do. I love you." Martin resumed sobbing in earnest, but no longer were the noises ripped from his throat twinged with despair. John gently led Martin around the chair by his hand and got him to kneel down so that John could wrap himself around him. Martin held him tightly, supporting him as Martin sobbed into his hospital gown, his tears soaking through the flimsy paper and wetting John's chest. John rested his head atop Martin's, shushing and cooing to him as he stroked his good hand against his back and rested his bad one on Martin's shoulders. Eventually, Martin's sobs developed into sniffles. He readjusted John's blanket and made sure he was settled nicely back into his chair. He patted the blanket down as he sniffled and wiped the last of his tears away from his eyes. "Please don't blame yourself, Martin," John told him. "I don't blame you, and nobody else should either." Martin laughed weakly. "Thank you, John." He still blamed himself. But John already knew those words weren't by some magical cure-all. He still blamed himself. But John already knew his words wouldn't be some magical cure-all. There was still Sasha and Tim, but he knew he'd bring the three of them around eventually. "Sorry for ruining our date," Martin winced. John just shook his head. "You didn't at all." Martin gave him a skeptical look. "I literally just cried a puddle into the front of your hospital gown. Not exactly typical first dates conversation." "And I got to hold you close and comfort you," John smiled at him, which was quite nice. Martin turned pink at that, the embarrassed flush looking much better on him, the one that had covered his face in response to his tears. Martin began to laugh and mumble something incoherently, but John stopped him by gently grabbing hold of his hand. Martin's eyes immediately shot to John's face in response. "Why don't we get back to our walk?" "We're right," Martin nodded, swallowing his ramblings and moving back to grab John's wheelchair, and slowly they resumed walking. They walked around the park for another hour or so, looping back around to the entrance to the hospital. "Do you want to get something to eat?" Martin asked. "I'm a bit peckish myself." "Yes, I think I would," John confirmed right before he caught sight of the man waiting ever so casually by the entrance back to the hospital. It wasn't that he didn't like seeing him, not at all. John just wished that his appearance wasn't in response to likely thinking Martin was attempting something untoward on their date. "Oh, hey guys," Tim grinned. "Were you both taking a walk around the park?" Yeah, Martin smiled as he shifted a bit. I just thought, we never really got that coffee date, and well, people go on walks for dates all the time, so bark. Cool, Tim nodded. Well, I totally did not sneak in some takeout in my bag, so if you're both up to it, we can eat in John's room? John could practically hear the sigh Martin bit off. Sure, Tim, sounds lovely. The trio then made their way back to John's room, Tim excitedly chatting all the while. John tried to get back into his bed on his own, but the sun had sapped any remaining strength in his body. Here, John, let me. Tim stepped forward to help John up, but Martin swooped in an instant, scooping John up into his arms in a bridal carry before carefully depositing John back into the bed, laying him down amongst the pillows. When Martin leaned back, John could see the small, satisfied smirk on his face as he pulled the covers over him. Thank you, Martin, John smiled at him. It's no problem, Martin leaned back. Tim let out a whistle. You two are getting pretty close. Did the date go well? It did, John agreed. I'm excited to take him out properly once I'm out of the hospital. And you've had your bed rest, Martin cut in. Right, about that, Tim said. I was thinking. Can't really leave you alone all day, so I was thinking maybe you could come stay at my place. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one with a spare room in my flat. He was. Martin had asked John to stay with him earlier, but he only had his own bed, and while Martin had offered to stay on the couch, John had refused. It was still too early to propose sleeping next to each other, as much as John wanted to. But Tim had the space, always open to lend a bed to a friend in need, and John was truly in need. Thank you, Tim, John accepted. I really appreciate that. Don't sweat it, boss man, Tim grinned. Honestly, it'll make me feel a whole lot better just to know you're somewhere safe. Yeah, Martin agreed. And we can come and help you out just like we have been now. He glanced at Tim awkwardly. Probably. Tim hesitated a moment before clapping Martin on the shoulder. Of course, Martin, we're a team. Archives crew against the world. Yeah, Martin smiled nervously. Exactly, we're going to trust each other and work forward from now on, John insisted. Exactly, Tim nodded, but John didn't miss the subtle glance he gave Martin. Damn it. This was fine. John could fix this. Tim and Sasha were likely just shaken by what happened, hurt and lashing out at the nearest source. It wasn't fair to Martin, but Tim and Sasha weren't dumb. They would come around. They just needed more time.